The start of a night shift. Max Carter, a 32-year-old cab driver, had grown accustomed to working the night shift. It was his choice. Nights were quieter, more lucrative, and strangely soothing. While the rest of the city slept or partied, he cruised its shadowy streets, a silent witness to countless untold stories. Tonight was supposed to be like any other. Max opened his ride-hailing app and adjusted the rearview mirror. His old Chrysler, a bit worn but well-maintained, was ready for another long haul. Night passengers came in many forms: chatty, drunk, nervous, or eerily silent. He thought he'd seen it all, but something about this night felt different. Probably just my imagination, he muttered, taking a swig of cold coffee from his thermos. His app chimed with a request. The pickup location was on the outskirts of the city, a dimly lit neighborhood known for its crumbling buildings and late-night trouble. He hesitated for a moment but accepted. Work was work. The first encounter. Max pulled up to the address, a decrepit apartment block with a flickering streetlight nearby. He killed the radio to avoid disturbing anyone and scanned the area. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and clad in a long black coat. His features were partially obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, but what Max could see was unsettling. Pale skin, a sharp nose, and piercing eyes that seemed to see too much. "Max Carter?" the man asked, his voice calm and deliberate. "That's me," Max replied, forcing himself to sound composed. "You called for a ride?" "I did," the man said, opening the rear door and sliding in without further explanation. "Where to?" "Phoenix Street, number 12, the man said, settling into the back seat. "That's quite a drive," Max noted. Punching the address into his GPS, the man said nothing in response. The strange conversation as they drove, an uncomfortable silence filled the cab. Max adjusted the volume on the radio, hoping to break the tension, but the man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you enjoy the city at night?" Max hesitated. "I guess. It's quieter. Has its charm." The man leaned forward slightly, his tone casual yet chilling. "Night reveals things hidden in daylight, doesn't it?" Max gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something about this man's demeanor felt wrong. "You drive nights often?" the passenger continued. "Yeah," Max replied tersely. "Why?" the man asked. "Do you enjoy listening to other people's stories? Or is it because you'd rather not talk about your own?" Max's stomach tightened. He stole a glance at the rearview mirror and froze. The man wasn't looking out the window or fiddling with his phone like most passengers. Instead, he stared directly at Max, his gaze unwavering. "That's a strange question," Max replied, his voice faltering slightly. "I ask because you strike me as someone carrying a heavy burden," the man said softly. "Someone who keeps driving, hoping the miles will make it disappear." Max forced a laugh, though his hands were sweating. "You don't know me, don't I?" Uncanny knowledge. The road wound through a desolate part of town. Empty lots and abandoned warehouses passed by in the glow of the headlights. Max hated this route. It reminded him of a place he tried to forget. "You grew up around here, didn't you?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. Max's heart skipped a beat. He glanced into the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know that?" "Your mother used to live in that old house on the corner of Bentley and Jackson. You'd run there after school, trying to avoid your father when he'd been drinking." Max slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and the passenger lurched forward slightly but didn't lose his composure. "How the hell do you know that?" Max shouted, his chest heaving. The man smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is how you feel now that I've said it." Max grabbed his phone, his hands trembling. He swiped at the screen, but it stayed black. No signal. "Stay calm, Max," the man said. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then what do you want?" Max snapped, his voice rising. "I want to help." Max laughed bitterly, gripping the steering wheel. "Help me? You're insane." "Am I?" the man replied, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Or do you feel this way because I'm right?" Part 2. A conversation that never ends. Max took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His pulse pounded in his ears. The passenger leaned back into the shadows of the seat, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Max demanded, his voice sharp but edged with fear. "Does it matter, Max?" the man asked, his tone casual yet infuriating. "It matters to me. You just said things about my life you couldn't possibly know." The man leaned forward again, his dark eyes locking onto Max's through the rearview mirror. "Your life is an open book, Max. A book you're too afraid to read." A shiver ran down Max's spine. "If this is some kind of blackmail—" "It's not blackmail," the man interrupted, his tone steady. "It's an opportunity." Max froze. An opportunity for what? To stop running. A familiar route. Max started the car again, though every instinct screamed at him to kick this stranger out. The route the GPS showed took them deeper into a part of the city Max hadn't visited in years. He gritted his teeth as familiar landmarks came into view. A boarded-up diner, a graffiti-covered convenience store, and finally, the old street. "Why here?" Max muttered. "You tell me," the man replied. Max gripped the steering wheel tighter. He hated this place. Hated what it reminded him of. "Your mother's house was there?" the man said, pointing to a crumbling two-story structure on the corner. "That's where you went to feel safe, wasn't it?" "But it wasn't always safe, was it?" Max slammed on the brakes again, his heart pounding. "That's enough. Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "A friend. Someone who knows you better than you'd like." Max's chest heaved as he fought to steady his breathing. This man wasn't just some lunatic spouting nonsense. He knew things Max hadn't told anyone. "I'm calling the police," Max said, grabbing his phone again. But the screen remained black. "The police can't help you, Max," the man said softly. "They never could. And you know it." Max's hands trembled. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to face what happened that night." The night he couldn't forget. Those words hit Max like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled, dragging him back to memories he'd buried deep at a dark street. A flickering lamppost, a shout, and then silence. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," the man whispered. "You've been running from it ever since. But the thing about running, Max, is that eventually you run out of road. What really happened that night? Why does the passenger know so much? And what does he want from Max?" Part 3. The road to nowhere. The car idled in the middle of the desolate street, headlights casting pale beams over cracked asphalt and overgrown sidewalks. Max sat frozen in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, and the stranger in the back seat seemed to know it. "You can't avoid it forever," the man said, his voice calm yet relentless. Max spun around, glaring at him. "What do you want from me? Why are you in my car?" "I told you," the man replied, leaning forward slightly. "I'm here to help you, to give you clarity. But you have to be willing to see it." "See what?" Max barked, though his voice cracked under the weight of his fear. The man tilted his head, studying Max as if weighing his words carefully. "Do you ever think about him?" The question landed like a sledgehammer. Max's breath hitched, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "Him," Max echoed, his voice barely a whisper. "You know who I mean," the man said. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was worse. It was pitying. Max stared out the windshield, unable to meet the stranger's gaze. Memories began to surface, unbidden and vivid, like they had been waiting just beneath the surface for someone to rip the lid off. The incident, it had been 7 years ago. Max was 25, still figuring out his life after college, and working odd jobs to make ends meet. That night, he had been out with friends, celebrating a minor victory. A raise at his dead-end retail job. They'd been walking home when it happened. The alley had been dark, the streetlight above it broken. At first, Max hadn't noticed the commotion. A muffled cry, a scuffle, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. But when he turned his head, he saw it. A man lay sprawled on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him. Another figure stood over him, a knife glinting in the faint light before the assailant bolted into the shadows. Max froze. His friends froze. The man on the ground had been gasping for air, clutching his side. "Call 911," one of Max's friends shouted. But Max couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He'd wanted to help, to run to the man's side, but his body betrayed him. Instead, he turned and ran. Back to the present. Max's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He hadn't told anyone about that night. Not his family, not his coworkers, not even the police. His friends had promised to stay silent too. "You weren't the one who stabbed him?" the man said from the back seat, as if reading Max's thoughts. "But you left him there, didn't you?" Max's stomach churned. He wanted to shout, to tell the stranger to shut up, but the words wouldn't come. "Why are you doing this?" Max asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Because you can't keep running from it," the man replied. "That night defined you, Max. It shaped every decision you've made since. And deep down, you know it." A dead end. Max forced himself to look at the GPS. The route hadn't changed, still pointing toward Phoenix Street. His hands trembled as he shifted the car into drive and began moving again. "Why Phoenix Street?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "That's where the answers are," the man said cryptically. "What answers?" "You'll see when we get there." Max bit back a retort, his frustration mounting. The man's vague responses and eerie calmness were wearing on him as they drove. The city seemed to fade around them. The streets became emptier, the lights dimmer. Max glanced at the dashboard clock. It flickered strangely, the numbers warping before settling on 2:06 a.m. "That can't be right," Max muttered. "What's wrong?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Max shook his head. The clock had been fine earlier. "A stop along the way. Pull over here," the man said suddenly. Max hesitated. They were on a deserted stretch of road flanked by abandoned warehouses. He couldn't see any reason to stop. Why? Just do it. Against his better judgment, Max obeyed. He brought the car to a halt and cut the engine, the silence around them deafening. The man gestured toward a dark alley between two buildings. "Go there." Max stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane? I'm not going into some random alley." "You've been here before?" the man said, his voice steady. Max's blood ran cold. "No," he said firmly. "I haven't." "You have," the man insisted. 7 years ago." Max's chest tightened. He looked at the alley again, and suddenly, it did feel familiar. The graffiti on the walls, the broken streetlight, the faint smell of mildew. All of it came rushing back. "No," Max whispered, his voice breaking. "You left him here," the man said, his tone devoid of judgment. "But he never left you." A haunting revelation. Max's breathing grew shallow as he stared at the alley. Images flashed through his mind. The man's bloodied body, the knife, the panicked look on his friends' faces. I didn't do anything," Max stammered. "Exactly," the man said. Max turned back to face him, anger and fear boiling inside him. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The man leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Max's. "I want you to remember, not just what happened but how it felt. The fear, the guilt, the shame. You've buried it for years, but it's still there, eating away at you." Max shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Why now? Why after all this time?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Because you can't move forward until you face it." A choice to make. Max slumped back in his seat, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He glanced at the alley again, his stomach churning. "What's down there?" he asked finally. "The truth," the man said. Max clenched his fists. He didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at him to drive away, to leave this place and never look back. But deep down, he knew the man was right. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The man didn't follow. "Go," the man said simply. Max hesitated, his legs feeling like lead. With a deep breath, he forced himself to walk toward the alley. The shadows seemed to swallow him whole as he ventured deeper. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears. And then, he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the alley, barely illuminated by the flickering light above. "Hello!" Max called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Max took another step, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" And then the figure turned. Part 4. The truth in the shadows. Max froze as the figure turned to face him. The dim, flickering light at the end of the alley revealed a man dressed in a tattered gray hoodie and jeans, his features obscured by shadows. Something about him felt wrong. Not just the situation, but the man himself. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. "Who are you?" Max demanded, his voice shaky but loud enough to echo slightly in the narrow alley. And no response. Max's heart raced. Each step forward an act of sheer willpower. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, why he hadn't just driven away, leaving the strange passenger and this cursed alley behind. But something deeper, stronger, kept him moving. He stopped just a few feet from the figure. The man's head tilted slightly, as if examining him. And then, with a voice so soft it barely registered above the hum of the distant city, he spoke. "Do you remember me?" Max staggered back, his blood running cold at a familiar face. "No," Max said, shaking his head violently. "No, I don't know you." The figure took a step forward, his movements eerily smooth. The light caught his face this time, young, pale, with eyes that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. And yet, there was something disturbingly familiar about him. "You don't remember my name, do you?" the man said, his tone devoid of anger or malice. "But I remember yours, Max." Max clenched his fists, the air in the alley suddenly feeling too thin. "Who are you?" he demanded again, though his voice cracked this time. "I'm someone you left behind," the man said, taking another step closer. "I'm someone you didn't save." 7 years ago, the memories hit Max like a freight train. 7 years ago, he had stood in this very alley. He had watched as the young man before him, this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger, lay bleeding on the ground. Max had heard his gasping breaths, seen the fear in his eyes, and done nothing. "What was his name?" the voice in his head screamed. "Why don't you remember his name?" "I couldn't help you," Max said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. You ran," the man interrupted. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was worse. It was hollow, as if the truth of Max's failure didn't even hurt anymore. Max staggered back, clutching his head. "I didn't know what to do. I wasn't." "You weren't ready to be brave," the man said, finishing the sentence for him. "You weren't ready to do what needed to be done." A passenger in the dark. Suddenly, the alley seemed to stretch and shift around Max. The graffiti-covered walls warped, the ground beneath him felt unsteady, and the distant hum of the city faded into an eerie silence. Max turned to look back at his car, but it was gone. Instead, the strange man from the back seat stood where the car had been, his dark coat swaying slightly in a non-existent breeze. "Do you see it now, Max?" the passenger said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Do you understand why I'm here?" Max shook his head, his mind reeling. "You're not real. None of this is real." The man in the coat smiled faintly. "I'm as real as the choices you made. I'm as real as the guilt you carry. And now, Max, you have a choice to make. The impossible choice." "What choice?" Max snapped, his fear giving way to anger. "I don't understand any of this." The man in the coat stepped forward, his presence commanding and unrelenting. "You've spent 7 years running from this moment. But tonight you can finally make it right." "How?" Max shouted, tears streaming down his face. The man gestured toward the younger figure at the end of the alley. "He's still here, still waiting for you to decide." Max's head spun. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "This doesn't make any sense. He's dead." "I saw him die." "Did you?" the man in the coat asked, tilting his head. "Or did you leave before you could know for sure?" The moment of truth. Max turned back to the younger figure. He looked closer now, really looked, and for the first time, he noticed the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. The way his lips parted slightly as if gasping for air, he was alive. "Oh my God," Max whispered. He's alive. The man in the coat stepped beside him, his voice low and calm. This is your chance, Max. Go to him. Help him. Do what you didn't do before. Max hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. Not this time. He took a step forward. Then another. And another. The younger man's eyes met his, wide with fear but flickering with a faint glimmer of hope. Max knelt beside him, his hands shaking. I'm here, he said, his voice breaking. I'm here now. The younger man's lips moved, forming a single word. Why? Max didn't have an answer. A glimpse of redemption. The world around him seemed to blur and fade, the alley melting into a strange, weightless void. Max's mind swam with emotions, regret, fear, hope, but one feeling stood above all the rest, determination. When his vision cleared, he was back in his car. The passenger was gone. The clock on the dashboard read 7:12 a.m., and the first rays of dawn lit up the city streets. Max sat in stunned silence, his breath catching in his throat. The alley, the figure, the man in the coat. It was all gone. But something inside him had shifted. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice on the other end answered, Max said, "There's something I need to report. Something I should have reported a long time ago." Part 5. The light at the end, the soft glow of dawn spilled across the city as Max sat in his car, the phone still pressed to his ear. For the first time in years he felt awake, alive. The person on the other end of the line asked for details, but Max could barely find the words. "I don't know if this makes sense," he said finally, his voice trembling. "But there's something I need to take responsibility for. Something I've been running from for too long." The operator on the other end paused for a moment before replying in a kind, measured tone. "It's never too late to do the right thing, sir. Can you come to the station?" "Yes," Max said. "I'll be there." He ended the call and gripped the steering wheel, his heart still pounding. His car felt different, lighter somehow, as if it too had been freed from the weight of the night. That a memory rekindled. Max began to drive. Not toward the police station just yet, but toward somewhere else. Somewhere he hadn't been in years. As the streets came alive with morning commuters, he turned onto a small, quiet road lined with weathered houses. He pulled up in front of a modest two-story home with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. His mother's house. It had been years since he'd been here, too many. After his father's death, Max had tried to stay connected, but guilt and shame had driven him away. Yet now, sitting outside the house, he felt an overwhelming pull to go inside. The front door creaked as he pushed it open. The familiar scent of old wood and lavender hit him instantly. The living room was cluttered with knickknacks, just as he remembered. And there, sitting in her favorite armchair with a crossword puzzle in her lap, was his mother. She looked up, startled, but her surprise quickly melted into warmth. "Max," she said, setting the puzzle aside. "I wasn't expecting you." Max hesitated, standing in the doorway like a stranger. I wanted to check on you. It's been a while." His mother's eyes softened, and she stood, crossing the room to pull him into a hug. "It's been too long," she whispered. A burden shared. They sat in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows as Max nursed a cup of coffee. For a while they talked about everything and nothing, the weather, her garden, the neighbors. But eventually, the conversation turned. "There's something I need to tell you," Max said, his voice heavy. His mother looked at him expectantly, her hands folded on the table. 7 years ago, he began, his words slow and deliberate. "Something happened, something I didn't know how to deal with. I saw someone get hurt, and I didn't help them. I ran." He expected her to look shocked or disappointed, but instead, she reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "We all make mistakes, Max," she said gently. "The important thing is what you do next." "I'm going to the police," Max said, his voice firm. "I'm going to tell them everything. I need to make this right." His mother nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you." The last fare that evening, Max got back in his car. The sky was painted with the warm hues of sunset, and the city seemed softer, quieter. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As he checked his rearview mirror, a chill ran down his spine. The man in the coat was sitting there again, his dark eyes calm and knowing. "You're back," Max said, his voice steady this time. "I never left," the man replied. "What happens now?" Max asked. The man smiled faintly. "That's up to you." Max nodded, gripping the wheel. "I'm ready." The man leaned back, his gaze shifting out the window. "Then drive. Max, drive toward the life you've been avoiding." And for the first time in years, Max didn't feel like he was running. He was moving forward. A new dawn the following day. Max walked into the police station. He spoke to an officer, recounting everything he remembered about that fateful night. It was painful, but with each word, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter. The officer thanked him for coming forward, and as Max stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. As he got back in his car, he noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. A faint shadow lingered on the back seat for just a moment before dissolving into the morning light. Max smiled, his grip on the wheel steady. "Thanks for the ride," he said softly. And with that, he drove off into a city that suddenly felt full of promise. Final note to the audience. Life is full of choices. Some we make in the moment and some we spend years avoiding. Max's story reminds us that it's never too late to face the truth, to take responsibility, and to find redemption. Because sometimes moving forward starts with turning back. The strange passenger Max Carter, a 32-year-old cab driver, was used to working the night shift. It was his choice. Nights were quieter, more lucrative, and carried a strange sort of calm. While the rest of the city slept or wandered the streets in search of fleeting thrills, Max was behind the wheel, a silent witness to countless stories. But tonight would be different. Max opened his ride-hailing app and adjusted his rearview mirror. His old Chrysler was clean and ready for another long haul. Passengers were always a mixed bag. Some chatty, some silent, and others far too drunk to even give proper directions. Tonight, however, Max couldn't shake an odd feeling. Something about the shift felt heavier. The app chimed, pulling him from his thoughts. A request popped up with a pickup location in one of the more desolate parts of town. A neighborhood with broken streetlights and boarded-up windows. He hesitated, then accepted the fare. Work was work. The first encounter. Max pulled up to the address, a decrepit apartment block with a flickering street lamp nearby. He killed the radio, not wanting to attract unnecessary attention, and scanned the area. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and clad in a long black coat. His features were partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but what Max could see made him uneasy. Pale skin, sharp features, and piercing eyes that seemed to see too much. "Max Carter?" the man asked, his voice calm and deliberate. "That's me," Max replied, forcing himself to sound composed. "You called for a ride?" "I did," the man said, opening the rear door and sliding in without hesitation. "Where to?" "Phoenix Street, number 12, the man said, settling into the back seat. "That's a ways off," Max noted. Punching the address into his GPS, the man said nothing. The strange conversation as they drove, an uncomfortable silence filled the cab. Max glanced in the rearview mirror. The man wasn't looking at his phone or the city lights outside like most passengers. Instead, his gaze was fixed, unwavering, on Max himself. "Do you enjoy the city at night?" the man asked suddenly, his voice startlingly clear in the quiet car. Max hesitated. "I guess. It's quieter. Has its charm." The man leaned forward slightly, his tone casual but unervingly precise. "Night reveals things hidden in daylight, don't you think?" Max gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something about the way the man spoke sent a shiver down his spine. "You drive nights often?" the man continued. "Yeah," Max replied, keeping his tone short. "Why?" the man asked. "Do you enjoy listening to other people's stories? Or is it because you'd rather not talk about your own?" Max's stomach tightened. He stole another glance at the rearview mirror. The man's gaze hadn't shifted. "That's a strange question," Max said. "I ask because you strike me as someone carrying a heavy burden," the man said softly. "Someone who keeps driving, hoping the miles will make it disappear." Max forced a laugh, though his hands were damp with sweat. You don't know me, don't I? Uncanny knowledge. The road wound through a desolate part of town. Abandoned warehouses, empty lots, and dimly lit intersections passed in eerie silence. You grew up around here, didn't you? The man asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Max's breath hitched. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, his eyes narrowing. How do you know that? Your mother lived in that old house on the corner of Bentley and Jackson. You'd run there after school, trying to avoid your father when he'd been drinking. Max slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the man in the back barely shifting in his seat. How the hell do you know that? Max demanded, his voice shaking. The man smiled faintly. Does it matter how I know? What matters is how you feel now that I've said it. Max fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling. He swiped at the screen, but it stayed black. No signal. Stay calm, Max, the man said. I'm not here to hurt you. Then what do you want? I want to help. Max barked a bitter laugh. Help me? You're insane. Am I? The man replied, leaning forward. Or do you feel this way because I'm right? The incident, the memories hit Max like a freight train. 7 years ago, he had stood in a dark alley not far from here. He and his friends had been walking home when they saw it happen. A man stabbed, collapsing to the pavement in a pool of blood. Max had frozen. His friends had screamed for someone to call for help, but Max couldn't move. The sight of the blood, the gasping breaths of the man on the ground. It paralyzed him, and then, in a moment of panic and cowardice, he ran. The passenger's truth, you left him there. The man in the back seat said, his tone neutral but heavy with meaning. Max gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I didn't know what to do. You knew, the man said softly. You just couldn't face it. Max's chest tightened, the memories now flooding back in painful clarity. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Why are you doing this? He asked finally. Because it's time, the man said. Time for you to stop running. The final destination. The GPS dinged, announcing that they'd arrived. Max looked out the windshield to see a familiar alley, now bathed in the pale glow of a street lamp. This is where it happened, the man said. Max shook his head, his breath catching. Why here? What do you want me to do? The man in the back seat smiled faintly. Go see for yourself. Max hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears. But something compelled him to move. He opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, the glimpse of redemption as Max approached the alley. The shadows seemed to close in around him. And then he saw it. A faint figure standing at the far end. Hello, Max called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. He took another step closer, his heart racing. Who are you? The figure turned, and Max's breath hitched. It was the man he'd left behind all those years ago. You're still here? Max whispered. The man nodded, his expression both sorrowful and forgiving. And so are you. The morning after when Max opened his eyes, he was back in his car. The passenger was gone, and the sun was rising over the city. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty back seat. Then, with a deep breath, he started the car and drove to the police station. For the first time in years, he told the truth as he stepped outside. The weight he'd carried for so long finally lifted. The shadows were gone, replaced by the warmth of the morning light. And as Max got back in his car, he noticed the faintest hint of a smile in the rearview mirror. Life is full of choices. Some we make, and some we avoid. Max's story reminds us that facing our fears is the first step toward finding peace. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, because that's what inspires me to write interesting stories for you. Share in the comments why you listened to this story to the end, write what you wanted to hear the next story about.